Jesus went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. He began by saying to them, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. Freedom for prisoners and the oppressed, sight for the blind, good news for the poor." These are the phrases in Isaiah 61 that Jesus utilized as the foundation of his earthly ministry, a ministry that would soon be passed on to his first disciples, and from them, through the centuries, to us. We, the church, are called to this ministry, rooted not just in word, but in deed. But in our complex and ever-changing 21st century world, what does it look like to free the oppressed, to give sight to the blind, good news for the poor? What are the roots of poverty, injustice, and illness? And how can we move from talk to action? I61, named after the passage of Isaiah 61, is a global ministry of justice and compassion. It's a ministry developed by and based out of Vineyard Christian Fellowship of Boise. It functions as a network of ministry partners that include orphanages, education programs, environmental and agricultural projects, medical outreaches, and ministries who work to stop human trafficking. It's an equipping agency, providing experiential training for Christians in the field to address local and global crises. It's a voice to move the church to a place of greater awareness and involvement in areas of justice and compassion. I61 endeavors to be that loud voice crying out on behalf of those in poverty. We've identified 7 circles of world crisis. Each circle links to the rest, as no crisis is independent of the other. During this 9-week series, you'll be exposed to each circle and God's heart for the people trapped there.
On a global level, all 7 of these areas really keep people in poverty. And so we see this as a strategy, not just to get overwhelmed by the crisis, but actually to see how we can bring hope as a church, how we can bring hope in each of these 7 areas. Because as we do that, if you can imagine one community in the Philippines experiencing all 7 of these areas, and if we actually were intentional about bringing hope and training and healing in all 7 of these areas, that whole community would be transformed. And we would see God redeem his creation. We'd see him redeem the environment, the people, bring them out of poverty and give them hope and a future. Because poverty is not just a lack of things, it's a lack of options. And so as we bring hope of options to each of these 7 areas of crisis, we're actually bringing the gospel. Well, in I61, we see the crisis, the global crisis, broken up into 7 areas. And the first one is spiritual confusion. And it's really at the core of all the problems. All 7 of these areas really keep people in poverty. And the spiritual crisis is just people not knowing Jesus and the confusion that comes from that as people follow false religions and live in the way that they're not created to live. We see all kinds of effects from that, and it all goes back to Genesis 3, where Adam and Eve didn't believe that God loved them, and that's where the confusion starts. Undeveloped leadership really is the corruption of leadership, that where people are in positions of power for the wrong reasons. You know, it all starts with the family. When the family breaks down and the parents are not leading the children how they're called to lead, everything breaks down. And so you see corrupt leaders, you see corrupt politicians, corrupt kings, corrupt governments, people leading for greed and leading for the sake of power instead of loving and serving their people, which is really what Christ calls us to do as believers.
I think the educational inequality really boils down to access and opportunity. There's so many people in the world that just have a lack of opportunity, a lack of access to basic things in life that we need to survive, that we need to help ourselves to be able to pull ourselves out of the situations we're in. And education's at the core of that. If you have the ability to learn, if you have the ability to read, you have such a higher potential of providing for your family, providing for the things of your future. When you don't have that, you're just stuck. Like you're literally in bondage to the environment, to the people around you. The poor are the first ones to experience the power and the impact of an environmental disaster. And God is calling out for his whole creation. He's calling out for his people, but he's also calling out for his whole creation. He created this world and he called us to be tenders of this world. And if we're not going to care for the world, if we as Christians of the church don't have a value for the world and the environments that we live in, then sin will have its way. Sin will have its way and it will be rampant. And we see the effects of that. We see the effects of the church and of man letting go of its responsibility to care and steward the earth. And it's the poor that are suffering first.
God created food, he created it to grow in the right environment, and he created us to care for it and farm it in God's way. And there's a lot of hungry people and a lot of sick people because of the food that we're eating.
I'm just going to say it again. The poor are going to be the first ones to suffer because we have this gap of the haves and the have-nots. And as there's less and less of a resource, the haves are the ones that are going to take it out of the hands of the have-nots. And so the poor experience that. But it's not just limited to them, it's also us. The food that we eat, the food that we consume nowadays, the engineering of it, the lack of God's plan and his creation and his, the way that he created food to be for our bodies and the substance that it provides, it's not there anymore. And it affects us in huge ways. We see this, the spread of cancer and disease all throughout the world, and a big part of that has to do with the food that we eat.
On one of my mission trips, encountered this 2-year-old who was dying of malaria, and she was so sick, and the parents asked for us to pray for her. And of course we did that, and we could have just left it at that, but knowing that there was a treatment for malaria, we went and got that. It was only $10, and we were able to help save this child's life. And it can be complicated, it can be so simple. Teaching sanitation, washing hands, clean water. That circle of health and education, when you educate people about diseases and how to take care of their bodies, it can really transform a whole community. There's so many different aspects of human injustice, and basically it's treating people wrongly. It's not valuing them as the children that God has created them to be, and using people. And all through the prophets you see God speaking out against that, against injustice, because he is a God of justice and he's a God of love and mercy. And when he sees that child being abused, it breaks his heart. And when he sees that woman enslaved in trafficking because she's so poor that she has no choice, that breaks his heart. That's not how it's meant to be.
And God calls us to be sons and daughters of the living God. We're sons and daughters of the King, and yet we treat each other like we're animals sometimes. Man has looked at the condition of his heart and said, it is no good, and I'm okay with that. Let me do what is good for myself. And he does it. And it comes out in some of the most horrific ways when we look at these areas of human injustice.
We talk a lot about upstream versus downstream in I61. You can picture yourself in a remote village next to a river and seeing dead bodies floating down the stream. And that might be a little graphic, so I apologize, but you have a choice right there. You want to help take care of these bodies. Maybe some people are still alive. You want to see what you can do, and that's kind of the relief effort. But if you just stop there and don't see what's causing people to die, then the bodies are just going to keep coming. And so it's our job to take care of the people who are sick and dying right now, but also to go upstream and to see what is the root cause of that. Each circle has upstream issues that are causing that. Ultimately sin is the main upstream issue, but it takes shape in many different ways. As you embark on this 9-week study, I just encourage you to be open and to be intentional. And my husband Michael and I have led a lot of discipleship schools, and the students who really saw their lives be transformed by Christ were the ones who put their all into it. What they got out of the school is what they put into it. And so even though your church may do lots of small groups, and maybe this is just another drop in the bucket, and you guys, I'm sure some of this might just be preaching to the choir where you're already doing a lot of this, but I just encourage you to be open and to be in His Word through these devotionals every day, and to come to your small group just open and excited about what God is going to speak, and He will speak.
You are a vessel of God's kingdom. God has called you for a purpose and a reason. And sometimes we make that smaller than what it really is. We see ourselves differently than the way God sees us and who God has created us to be. And I just encourage you to be open. Allow God to really speak to you and who He's created you to be specifically, and what that might look like through the lens of some of these issues in the world. What does it look like for you to be a vessel of His kingdom, His presence, in the midst of such horrific situations and topics?